"Ma'am, can you tell me what blue looks like?" The millionaire's blind son whispered in the silence of the mansion's dining hall. His father froze in irritation, ready to dismiss him, but the only one who stopped to answer was a black woman scrubbing the marble floor. In that fragile moment, everything in their lives quietly began to shift. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. The Blackstone Mansion towered over Chicago's wealthy district, a fortress of glass walls, chandeliers, and cold silence. Every corner of the $15 million estate carried Ethan's name, a man who believed power and money could buy solutions to every problem. But there was one truth his fortune could not erase. His 9-year-old son, Owen, had never seen the world around him. Owen's childhood was filled with darkness. Born blind, he relied on touch and memory to navigate endless hallways where servants whispered and doors stayed locked. Specialists from Boston, Geneva, even Tokyo had paraded through the mansion. They spoke of protocols, genetic therapies, and experimental hopes. Each ended the same way: a polite shrug, a signature on Ethan's check, and no change in Owen's empty gaze. That morning, Owen's innocent question had sliced through the silence. Ethan clenched his jaw. He hated weakness, hated when his son reminded him of the one failure money couldn't fix. "Enough," he muttered, closing his laptop stacked with contracts worth millions. His voice was flat, dismissive. Yet before Owen could lower his head in shame, a gentle answer came from the corner. "Blue, it feels like the morning sky brushing against your skin," said the cleaner softly, her hands red from scrubbing marble tiles. Her name was Monique, a black woman in her 60s, with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that carried stories of survival. She had only been hired last week, invisible to Ethan, but not to Owen. The boy tilted his head toward her voice. "It sounds warm." Monique smiled quietly. In that instant, Owen's face lit up, not with sight, but with something his father's millions had never bought: comfort. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had no patience for maids crossing boundaries. Yet what unsettled him most was not her words. It was his son's fragile smile, the first one in weeks. The following days moved with the rhythm Ethan demanded: scheduled, controlled, efficient. Every morning at 6, Monique arrived through the servants' entrance, her shoes damp from the cold Chicago sidewalks. She moved silently across polished corridors, carrying buckets and brushes, blending into the background like furniture. That was how Ethan preferred his staff: invisible. Owen, however, noticed her presence. He could always tell when she entered the room, guided not by sight but by the sound of her soft humming, a tune that reminded him of safety. He would wait for her footsteps, pressing his palms against the hallway wall until she came close enough to whisper a kind greeting. "Good morning, Miss Monique." "And a good morning to you, sweetheart," she would answer, her tone warm enough to brighten his day. Ethan despised these exchanges. He would stand at the top of the staircase, scowling, listening to the way his son's laughter broke through the silence. To him, joy was not the maid's duty. Joy was something professionals were supposed to provide at $1,000 an hour. Later, therapists would arrive, strict men and women in press suits, carrying binders thicker than Owen's arms. They spoke in cold technical terms, measuring progress in sterile percentages. Owen obeyed them, stumbling through their instructions, while his father nodded impatiently, always asking, "When will he see? How long until results?" But no laughter came from those sessions. Only tears Owen tried to hide. In contrast, Monique's small moments carried a different power. She showed him textures of fabrics while folding laundry, silk versus cotton, smooth against rough. She let him touch the petals of fresh flowers she placed in vases, describing their colors with words he could feel. "Red feels bold, like a drumbeat in your chest," she explained. Owen would smile and press the flower to his cheek, storing her descriptions deep in his heart. At night, Ethan sat in his study, sipping expensive scotch, scrolling through contracts and medical invoices. "One of these doctors will fix him," he muttered, his voice sharp with certainty. He believed cures were commodities, just another product to be bought. But in the quiet corners of the mansion, away from Ethan's watchful eyes, Owen's world was already changing. Not through wealth, not through science, but through the gentle patience of a woman the millionaire refused to see. The tension finally cracked one afternoon. Ethan had just finished a tense call with overseas investors when Owen's laughter drifted through the open window from the garden. It was not the polite chuckle he gave to therapists. This was unrestrained, joyous, and foreign in a house that thrived on silence. Ethan stormed outside. There, beneath the trimmed hedges, Monique sat beside Owen on a stone bench, letting him explore the different textures of leaves she had plucked from the trees. "This one is smooth, like calm water," she explained gently. "And this one, rough like bark you climb." Owen traced the edges with wonder. "It feels alive," he whispered, smiling wider than Ethan had seen in months. The sight ignited Ethan's fury. "Monique!" His voice cracked like a whip. She rose immediately, hands folded, but her calm eyes did not waver. "I told you to keep your distance from my son," he snapped. "Sir, I only speak with him while I work. He seems lonely." "Lonely?" Ethan's laugh was bitter. "He has the best specialists in this country. Therapists from Harvard, doctors from Boston. He doesn't need chatter from a cleaning lady." Owen's face fell, but Monique placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "With all due respect, sir, sometimes loneliness cannot be cured with money." The audacity of her reply made Ethan's jaw tighten. He stepped forward, towering over her. "You are here to scrub floors, not give advice about my son. If I hear you interfering again, you will be dismissed immediately." Monique nodded respectfully, but her eyes carried something unshakable, something Ethan could not intimidate. It unsettled him more than he admitted. That night, as she folded sheets in her small room at the back of the mansion, Monique's thoughts drifted to her childhood in rural Louisiana. Her grandmother, Miss Aaliyah, had raised her with lessons money could never teach. In the 1960s, when doctors refused to treat black families, Miss Aaliyah had brewed remedies from herbs in her backyard, whispering prayers of faith as she worked. "Some cures," she always said, "come from love, not books." Monique had seen those cures heal cataracts, soothe fevers, and calm despair. She carried those lessons like sacred inheritance, tucked away in her worn notebook, passed through 5 generations of black women who had survived prejudice by clinging to knowledge others dismissed as superstition. Her life had been a cycle of hardship. Cleaning homes where she was treated like furniture, raising children alone after her husband's tragic death in a factory accident, marching in Montgomery for civil rights only to return to scrub the kitchens of those who denied her dignity. Yet none of it had broken her spirit. Now she faced Ethan, a man who wore his wealth like armor, blind to the truth standing in his own house. Monique had encountered his kind before. Powerful men who confused arrogance for wisdom. Men who believed their money made them untouchable. But Monique knew something Ethan did not. Even in the darkest places, light finds a way to break through, and that light had already begun to shine in Owen's eyes. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. Nights in the Blackstone mansion were heavy with silence. Ethan often left for late dinners or business meetings, his calendar filled with appointments that mattered more to him than the boy upstairs. Once the echo of his polished shoes faded into the distance, the house softened, and Monique quietly made her way to Owen's room. The boy would already be waiting, clutching his teddy bear, listening for her gentle footsteps. "You came," he whispered. "I always do," she replied with a smile. "Promises mean something where I come from." From her apron pocket, she would draw out a small glass vial wrapped in cloth. Inside was a homemade ointment, thick and golden, made with herbs her grandmother had once grown in Louisiana. Monique dipped her fingers lightly, rubbing the mixture along Owen's eyelids. Then she placed her palms gently against his face, whispering words of faith passed down through generations. "Breathe deep, child. Tell me what you feel." At first, there was nothing. Darkness remained unbroken. But after several nights, Owen gasped. "There's something," he whispered, "like a tiny spark. Not outside, but inside my head." Monique's heart skipped, but she kept her voice calm. "That spark will grow. It is the beginning of light. Owen, The boy clung to her words as if they were treasures. Every night, the ritual continued. Ointment, prayer, whispered encouragement. Slowly, changes began to show. Owen walked with more confidence. He stumbled less against furniture. He described shadows, faint outlines, and once, the dim glow of sunlight pressing through the curtains. Ethan noticed the changes too, but his pride blocked the truth. At the weekly medical appointments, when doctors commented on Owen's stronger reflexes and improved alertness, Ethan puffed his chest with satisfaction. The experimental protocol must be working, Dr. Connor said, scribbling notes on a clipboard. Ethan nodded firmly. I told you, money always finds a cure. Never once did he suspect that the progress had nothing to do with the expensive therapies he financed. To him, Monique was still invisible, just another pair of hands paid to scrub marble floors. But Owen knew better. At night, when the treatments left his body aching, it was Monique who soothed him with stories of hope. She told him about her grandmother, who healed dozens of people when white doctors turned them away. She told him about faith, the kind that did not come from laboratories, but from love. One evening, Owen asked softly, "Why do you help me, Miss Monique?" She touched his cheek, her voice steady. "Because I see you, child. Not your blindness, not your father's wealth. Just you." Those words carved deep into his heart. For the first time, Owen began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he would see the world. And while Ethan flaunted his wealth to investors and newspapers, crediting science for every tiny step forward, the real miracle was happening in secret, in the quiet hands of a black woman he dismissed as nothing. Weeks turned into months, and with every passing day, Owen's progress grew harder to ignore. He moved more confidently, traced objects with his fingers, and sometimes even described faint colors that shimmered in his imagination. But Ethan saw only an opportunity. He organized a press conference in the grand hall of the mansion, chandeliers blazing above a sea of reporters. Cameras clicked, microphones hovered, and Ethan appeared in his finest suit, Owen seated quietly in the front row. "My son is responding remarkably well to the treatments I brought from the Mayo Clinic," Ethan declared, his voice firm and rehearsed. "We've invested millions this year alone, and the results speak for themselves. This is the future of medicine." Dr. Connor, standing at his side, nodded solemnly. "The protocol is revolutionary. Young Owen is proof of progress at the cutting edge of science." Reporters scribbled in their notebooks, but not all seemed convinced. One journalist asked pointedly, "What about the daily care? Someone in the home must be assisting him constantly." Ethan gave a dismissive laugh. "Our staff is purely functional, unqualified to handle something so complex. It is the doctors who deserve the credit." Monique stood silently at the back, arranging coffee cups for the guests. She kept her face neutral, but her hands trembled because she knew the truth. Each improvement Owen had made was carefully written in her notebook, alongside the dates and times. A secret log she hid under her mattress. March 12th, distinguished shadow in hallway. March 20th, recognized silhouette from 3 meters. March 28th, described color of sunlight. Every night, she added more. Quiet proof that love and faith had achieved what science could not. After the press conference, as reporters filed out, one of them lingered. A young woman from the Chicago Tribune noticed Owen glanced repeatedly toward Monique, almost as if searching for reassurance. It was a detail subtle enough to escape most, but not her trained eye. She jotted a note in her pad, checked timeline of progress versus new staff hire. Meanwhile, Ethan celebrated his victory. He hosted a dinner for executives, boasting shamelessly. Yes, it cost a fortune, but when you have unlimited resources, the impossible becomes possible. Laughter filled the room, clinking glasses sealing his arrogance. In the kitchen, Monique listened quietly, her resolve hardening. She had faced powerful men before, men who used wealth to hide prejudice. But she knew something Ethan refused to admit. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how tightly it is buried. And soon his entire empire of lies would begin to crumble. The truth cracked open on an ordinary morning. Owen burst into the kitchen, his small hands trembling with excitement. "Dad, I can see the red flowers under my window," he shouted. Ethan nearly dropped his coffee cup. Red flowers? What red flowers? The ones Miss Monique planted so I could practice colors. Owen explained innocently, his eyes glowing with new life. Ethan froze. Monique had never asked permission to plant anything. More importantly, his son had just described a color. He turned sharply toward her, suspicion burning in his gaze. "Explain this," he demanded. "Word for word. What have you been doing to my son?" Monique took a steady breath. For months she had remained silent, but the moment had arrived. She pulled out the worn notebook from her apron pocket and placed it on the table. "Your son's healing," she said softly, "didn't come from your doctors or your millions. It came from faith, love, and remedies passed down through generations. Every progress is written here, every date, every detail." Ethan snatched the notebook, flipping through the pages. His hand shook as he read. March 15th. Owen distinguished light from shadow. March 22nd. Recognized my silhouette. April 3rd. Described blue of the pool. Photographs were taped alongside, each time-stamped, undeniable. "This is impossible," he muttered, though the conviction in his voice was gone. "Impossible is what you believed," Monique replied calmly, while parading her pride in front of cameras. "But miracles do not come from arrogance, mister. Blackstone, they come from truth." At that very moment, Owen entered again, sensing the tension. He looked between them and whispered the words that shattered Ethan's world. "Dad, it wasn't the doctors. It was always Miss Monique. She made me believe I could see." The silence that followed was unbearable. Ethan's pride collapsed beneath the weight of his son's confession. That afternoon, the Chicago Tribune published a headline that spread like wildfire across the nation. "Millionaire falsely claims credit for miracle cure performed by Black woman." Within hours, phones in the mansion rang endlessly. Investors demanded explanations. The company board called emergency meetings. Social media erupted with fury. Arrogant CEO steals credit from humble maid. Reporters crowded the mansion gates, microphones raised high. Each headline cut deeper than the last. "Truth outs rich man's lie. Justice for the Black woman who healed." Ethan's empire, built on arrogance, began to collapse. Contracts worth millions were canceled overnight. His partners distanced themselves, unwilling to be tied to scandal. Even Dr. Connor withdrew, declaring he could no longer associate with false claims. Through it all, Monique stood steady. She had not sought attention, yet dignity wrapped around her like armor. For years she had been invisible, a shadow in wealthy homes. Now the world saw her clearly. And beside her, Owen smiled with eyes full of light, his small hand gripping hers. The boy who had once lived in darkness had become living proof that the power of love could defeat even the deepest prejudice. 6 months later, the mansion that once symbolized Ethan's power stood empty, a giant for sale sign hammered into its front lawn. The empire he had bragged about collapsed under the weight of scandal. Investors withdrew, clients vanished, and his reputation was beyond repair. The man who once commanded boardrooms now lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Chicago, haunted by headlines that would never fade. Meanwhile, Monique's life transformed in ways she had never imagined. What began as whispered prayers and quiet remedies inside a boy's bedroom had become national news. She was invited onto morning shows, where audiences wept as Owen stood beside her, describing the first time he had seen sunlight. Donations poured in from across the country, and with that support, Monique opened a small community clinic in Southside Chicago. She named it Mama Aaliyah's Healing Center in honor of her grandmother. There, people who had been ignored by hospitals lined up daily, seeking not only remedies but the hope Monique carried in her presence. Universities requested her to speak about ancestral wisdom, blending compassion with science. For the first time in her 60 years, she was treated not as invisible, but as a woman of profound dignity. Owen thrived in his new life. He enrolled in school, chasing soccer balls across the field, painting colorful pictures that decorated his bedroom walls. His laughter filled every corner of his new home, a sound no longer stifled by silence. And whenever someone asked who had helped him see, his answer never changed. "Miss Monique gave me light." One rainy afternoon, Ethan swallowed his pride and walked into Monique's clinic. He stood awkwardly among the rows of waiting patients, a man stripped of arrogance. When Monique finally appeared, tending to a child's bandaged arm, their eyes met. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice rough, his hands trembling. Monique placed a lavender flower in his palm. "You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Blackstone. You owe it to your son and to yourself." Through the window, Owen's laughter rang out as he chased butterflies in the clinic's garden. Ethan turned to watch, his eyes wet with the realization that the true wealth he had sought all his life had never been in his bank account. It had always been in the compassion of the woman he once dismissed as nothing. Monique looked on, her head held high, against arrogance, against prejudice. She had planted something stronger than any cure, the belief that love can heal where money never will. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.